Today's lecture is going to focus on the end of World War II, kind of what it looks like, how the ending comes, and then the next lecture will talk about the legacies of World War II. So before we can talk about the end of the war, we just need to recap a couple of quick things. If you remember, the war in the Pacific was really a bunch of island hopping, right? You had all these battles over islands between the United States and the Japanese. At the Battle of Midway, that's where the United States was able to turn things around, right, and start to move the war closer and closer to the main island of Japan at that time. And Okinawa now was the final step. So the Battle of Okinawa takes place starting in April of 1945, and there is an American victory there. And what happens at that point is that the remaining Japanese troops surrender. Notice it's not the country of Japan surrendering, their leadership isn't surrendering, but the remaining Japanese soldiers at Okinawa had surrendered. What that did with an American victory is it clears the way for us. It gives us a path to get to the main island of Japan. So this is where it was time for the United States to really make a decision. Do we want to invade the main island of Japan? So you have a sea invasion, obviously, but then fight them on their home turf? Or is this a time maybe to use these bombs that we have at our disposal? We knew that if we were to invade Japan, it was going to be incredibly intense. They were not going to back down. If you think about it, they had kamikaze missions where they would willingly, fly their planes into ships at Pearl Harbor, right? Surrender was a source of ultimate shame for the Japanese. And so we knew that it was going to be rather difficult, both the financial toll and human toll, if we were to invade them on the mainland of Japan. In order to understand the decision-making process that the United States went through once we defeated the Japanese at Okinawa, we need to know what we had at our disposal, right? We talk about these bombs, well, what exactly were they? So we need to rewind a little bit here to 1939. You can see, well before the United States was even in the war. Again, we don't join until the end of 1941. But in August of 1939, FDR, who was the president at the time, of course, had received a message that Germany had the technology to build this new form of bomb. And, he believed that we need to have more powerful weapons than Germany does, and we need to have them sooner than Germany does. And so he establishes a top secret project to beat Germany to the building of these bombs. That project becomes known as the Manhattan Project. And as you can see on the slide there, on July 16th of 1945, scientists actually test the world's first atomic bomb. So the next big question for our country to answer is whether or not to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. And that question is going to be answered by the new president, Harry Truman. So let's talk a little bit about how he comes into office. So on April 12th of 1945, the unexpected death of the current president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, occurs. While it was a surprise to many of the American people, it was not a surprise to his doctors and his close friends and family, as he had been in failing health for quite some time. And he actually ends up dying from a brain hemorrhage. One thing to know and to think about, remember, is he was this beloved hero, right? He was the leader. He was loved by the people. People looked at him for helping through the Great Depression. Although we know that actually World War II production is what gets us out of the Depression, people really looked at FDR as a hero. And now that he's gone, what are we going to do, and who do we turn to? And the person we turn to ends up being the Vice President, Harry S. Truman, as he steps into the role of the president. And not much was known about Harry Truman at the time. We don't often know a lot about our vice presidents. We do maybe more today than they would have then, just because of the internet and social media, and we learn a little bit more about them. But we maybe didn't know as much about the vice presidents during this era. So Truman steps in, and the decision now on his shoulders is whether we invade the main island of Japan or we drop the bomb on them. At the Potsdam conference, the Potsdam Declaration was made. And there were a few different components to it, but really one of the main ones is that it demanded surrender from Japan. So the United States says, hey, Japan, you need to surrender. If you don't, you will face prompt and utter destruction. Now, notice with that terminology, we don't tell them when it's going to be, where it's going to be, or maybe even what it's going to look like. But we tell them you would face prompt and utter destruction. Japan, of course, does not surrender, and that is no big surprise to anyone. So for Truman at that point, the decision to drop the bomb becomes rather easy. The bomb was created for military purposes. If we don't use it now, when would we use it? This is what it was absolutely created for, was a military decision. And so this would be the time to use it. So the people that were critical of Truman and his decision, he tells them to do their weeping at Pearl Harbor. Kind of the idea of saying, hey, you shouldn't feel bad for the Japanese people. You shouldn't feel bad for the Empire of Japan. They started this. If you want to weep, you want to feel bad for someone, feel bad for those that lost their lives at Pearl Harbor. After Truman makes the decision to drop the atomic bombs, it actually starts with just one bomb, right? That was the first idea, thinking that if we dropped one, Japan would see the devastation caused and would surrender. So the first one was dropped on August 6th of 1945, and it was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. If we look at the death toll there, over 80,000 people die instantly, but then you have over 100,000 that end up dying in total in the bombing, and it really impacted about 6 square miles in Hiroshima. At that point, Japan was then given the option to surrender, and they chose to not surrender at that time. So 3 days later, then on August 9th of 1945, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, killing 40,000 people instantly. Just a few days after the second bomb was dropped on Japan, Japan actually decided to surrender. So on August 14th of 1945, the Japanese government officially surrenders. This is known as VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, and it marks the official end of World War II.